I still remember the exact moment my world shattered. There I was, sitting in my cramped studio apartment in Chicago, scrolling through real estate listings out of habit when my childhood home popped up on my screen. Charming Victorian, great investment opportunity. I blinked twice, convinced I was hallucinating. The familiar wraparound porch, the stained glass window my father had painstakingly restored, the massive oak tree in the front yard where we had built countless tree houses. Listed at $475,000 by none other than Rebecca Wilson, exclusive agent. Rebecca Wilson. My sister-in-law. The woman who had barely waited 6 months after my brother David's funeral to start redecorating their house. And now, apparently, she was selling the property that had been in my family for 3 generations. The property that, according to my parents' will, was meant to be jointly owned by David and me, with his portion passing to me if he died without children. I called her immediately, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely hit the right numbers. When she answered with that saccharine voice of hers, I couldn't even form words. "Hello? Is anyone there?" she asked, annoyed. "Rebecca," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why is my house listed for sale on Zillow?" The silence on the other end lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. "Your house," she laughed, the sound like glass breaking. "I think you're confused, Emma. This is my property. David left everything to me." I had always had a complicated relationship with Rebecca. When David first introduced us 8 years ago, I tried my best to welcome her into our close-knit family. She was beautiful, ambitious, and charming, everything my quiet, thoughtful brother wasn't. Their opposites attract dynamic seemed to work, and I was happy if he was happy. Our parents had passed away in a car accident 3 years before David met Rebecca. The family home in Oakwood Heights, a historic neighborhood just outside Boston, had been left to both of us. David had moved in immediately while I pursued my art career in Chicago, coming home for holidays and long summer visits. We had an understanding. The house would always be there for both of us, a sanctuary we could return to whenever we needed. After David died suddenly of an aneurysm last year, I flew in for the funeral and stayed for 2 weeks. Rebecca had been distant, understandably grief-stricken. I offered to help sort through his things, but she insisted she wasn't ready. When I suggested moving back to help with the house, she said she needed space to process. I respected that and returned to Chicago, checking in regularly. The calls became less frequent. My texts often went unanswered. And now, 8 months after burying my only sibling, I discovered she was selling our family home without even mentioning it to me. "I have the will, Rebecca," I said, my voice steadier now. "The house belongs to both of us. David's share passes to me, not you." "That's not what our lawyer said," she replied coldly. "David and I had our own will drawn up after we married. This house is mine to sell, and frankly, Emma, I need the money. The insurance barely covered his medical bills." "You never mentioned any new will," I said, feeling the ground shift beneath me. "It wasn't your business," she snapped. "Look, I'm sorry you're upset, but I've already accepted an offer. The closing is in 3 weeks. The next morning, I booked a flight to Boston and called the only person who might help Martin Green, my parents' attorney who had drafted their original will. He agreed to meet me at his office the day I arrived. Walking through Boston's familiar streets felt surreal. This city had once been home, and now I was fighting to keep my last connection to it. Martin's office was exactly as I remembered, leather-bound books lining the walls, the scent of old paper and expensive cologne. He rose when I entered, his face grave. "Emma, I'm so sorry about the situation," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I've reviewed everything. Your parents' will is clear. The house was left equally to you and David, with a survivorship clause stating that if either of you died without children, the deceased's share would pass to the surviving sibling." I felt a momentary relief until he continued. However, Rebecca provided me with the will that David apparently signed 2 years ago, leaving his assets to her. It's properly executed, witnessed, and notarized. My stomach dropped. That's impossible. David would have told me. Martin looked uncomfortable. There's something else. The new will has a clause specifically revoking the survivorship provision from your parents' will. It's unusual, but legally sound. I left Martin's office feeling hollow. Outside, rain had started to fall, matching my mood perfectly. As I walked, my phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. My realtor told me you've been asking questions. Stop interfering or I'll file a restraining order. That night, in my hotel room, I pulled out old photo albums I'd brought from Chicago. In one, David and I stood on the porch of our family home, arms around each other, grinning widely. I noticed something in the background: Dad's old roll-top desk where he kept important documents. The desk that now sat in the attic of the house Rebecca was selling. Suddenly, I remembered something David had told me years ago. If anything ever happens to me, check the hidden compartment in Dad's desk. That's where I keep everything important. I had to get into that house. The next morning, I drove to Oakwood Heights. The neighborhood hadn't changed: manicured lawns, historic homes, the community garden at the corner where Mom had volunteered. I parked a block away and walked to the house, my heart racing. To my surprise, the spare key was still hidden in the fake rock by the garden shed. I hesitated only briefly before letting myself in through the back door. The house smelled different. Rebecca's perfume had replaced Mom's signature lavender. The furniture had been rearranged, family photos replaced with modern art. I moved silently upstairs, toward the attic door. The attic was the one place that seemed untouched. Dust covered everything: holiday decorations, old suitcases, Dad's workbench. And there, in the corner, was the roll-top desk. My hands trembled as I felt for the hidden latch David had shown me years ago. The compartment popped open, revealing a manila envelope labeled "Last Will and Testament David Wilson," with a date from just 2 months before his death. Footsteps on the stairs made me freeze. What the hell do you think you're doing in my house? Rebecca stood in the doorway, her face contorted with rage. I clutched the envelope to my chest. This is still my house too, Rebecca. And I've just found David's actual last will. She lunged forward, trying to grab the envelope. Give me that. You're trespassing. No, I said, stepping back. I'm standing in the home my parents left to me and my brother. The home he never intended for you to sell. Her face transformed into something ugly and unfamiliar. You always resented me. Always thought I wasn't good enough for your precious brother. Well, he chose me, not you. He loved you, I agreed, but he also loved this house and what it represented. Our family legacy. Legacy, she scoffed. This is just real estate, Emma. And I need the money. For what? I demanded. The insurance should have covered everything. A flash of something guilt crossed her face before she composed herself. Get out before I call the police. I held up the envelope. Go ahead. I'd love to explain to them how you tried to sell property that isn't legally yours. Later that night, back in my hotel room, I sat on the bed surrounded by papers from the envelope. David's real will was there, dated just 2 months before his death, leaving me his share of the house as our parents had intended. But there was something else: a letter addressed to me. Dear Emma, it began in David's familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, then I'm gone and something has gone wrong. I need to tell you about Rebecca. Things aren't what they seem. I discovered recently that she's been having an affair with her boss, Thomas, for over a year. When I confronted her, she swore it was over, but I found text messages proving otherwise. I was planning to file for divorce, but then my headache started getting worse. I'm writing this will to protect our family home. Rebecca never understood what this place means to us. All she sees is $signs. I've hidden this because I don't trust her anymore. If something happens to me before I can file for divorce, Please make sure she doesn't take everything we've built. I'm sorry for bringing her into our lives. I miss Mom and Dad every day. And I miss having you nearby. Maybe someday you'll move back home where you belong. I love you, sis. Always have, always will. David. Tears streamed down my face as years of memories flooded back. David helping me learn to ride a bike on the driveway. Building snow forts in the backyard. Him holding me as I cried after Mom and Dad's funeral, promising we'd always have each other. The pain of losing him hit me anew, coupled with the betrayal of what Rebecca had attempted. She had not only cheated on my brother, but tried to steal his legacy, our legacy. I remembered how I'd put my art career on hold after our parents died, moving to Chicago only because David insisted I follow my dreams. The house will always be here, he'd said. You can come back anytime. I hadn't been there when he needed me most. I hadn't noticed his marriage falling apart or protected him from Rebecca's betrayal. But I could protect his final wishes now. The next morning, I met with Martin again, showing him David's true last will and the letter. His eyebrows rose as he read. This changes everything, he said finally. This will is more recent than the one Rebecca presented, and it's properly executed. The letter isn't legally binding, but it establishes David's intent and raises serious questions about Rebecca's actions. What do I do now? I asked. We file this will with the probate court immediately and request an emergency hearing to stop the sale of the house. He paused, studying me. Emma, this will be messy. Rebecca won't go down without a fight. Neither will I said, a new resolve hardening within me. As I left his office, I ran into Susan Parker, my mother's best friend and our former neighbor in Oakwood Heights. Emma, what a wonderful surprise, she exclaimed, hugging me tightly. Are you moving back home? I noticed the for sale sign and wondered what was happening. Over coffee, I explained the situation. Susan's expression darkened as I spoke. I'm not surprised, she said finally. Rebecca has been different since David passed. There's been a man visiting regularly. I assumed it was her brother, but Thomas, I supplied. Her boss. Susan nodded grimly. And there's something else you should know. I overheard her at the supermarket, talking about using the house money to open a business with someone. A restaurant, I think. The final pieces clicked into place. Rebecca and her lover were planning to use my family's home, my inheritance, to fund their new life together. You know, Susan said thoughtfully, your mother always said you were the fighter in the family. David was the peacemaker, but you never backed down from what was right. Her words awoke something in me. Mom had been right. It was time to fight. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following week. Meanwhile, I hired a private investigator to look into Rebecca's finances. What he discovered shocked even me. We met in a quiet cafe downtown. The investigator, a former police detective named Jenkins, slid a folder across the table. Your sister-in-law has been busy, he said. She and Thomas Reynolds opened a joint bank account 3 months before your brother's death. There have been regular transfers from your brother's personal account to this joint account almost $200,000 over the last year of his life. That's impossible, I whispered. David would never. The transfers were all made online, using your brother's credentials, Jenkins continued. But here's where it gets interesting. Most were made while your brother was at work, according to his employee badge records I obtained. My blood ran cold. She was stealing from him while he was alive. Jenkins nodded. And there's more. I found evidence suggesting your brother's medical records were accessed multiple times from their home computer after he complained about headaches. Are you saying? I'm not saying anything definitive, Jenkins cautioned. But the timeline is suspicious. Your brother starts experiencing symptoms, his wife accesses his medical records repeatedly, and shortly after, he dies unexpectedly of an aneurysm. The implications were too horrific to contemplate. I thanked Jenkins and headed straight to the police station, where I filed a formal complaint requesting an investigation into David's death and Rebecca's financial activities. Walking back to my hotel, I received a text from an unknown number. Back off now or you'll regret it. Some secrets should stay buried. Attached was a photo of me entering Martin's office. They were watching me. Fear shot through me, but it quickly hardened into determination. I called Martin. I'm not staying at the hotel anymore, I told him. I've got a new plan. The next day, I moved into my family home, using my key to enter legally as a co-owner. I brought minimal belongings, some clothes, my laptop, and art supplies. The first thing I did was change the locks. When Rebecca discovered I'd moved in, she was livid. She showed up screaming, threatening to call the police. Go ahead, I said calmly. I have proof I'm a legal owner. You, on the other hand, have a lot of explaining to do about David's finances. Her face paled. What are you talking about? The joint account with Thomas. The money transferred from David's personal account. The suspicious timing of it all. She left without another word. That night, alone in the house for the first time, I felt David's presence everywhere. Sitting in his favorite chair in the library, I made a decision. I wasn't just fighting for ownership of this house anymore, I was fighting for justice for my brother. The next morning, I went up to the attic and pulled out my old canvases and paints. As sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, I began painting again for the first time since David's death. The image that emerged was the house itself, standing strong against a stormy sky. Over the next few days, I reclaimed the space. I moved David's photos back onto the mantel. I replanted Mom's herb garden that Rebecca had let die. I restored Dad's workshop in the basement where he'd taught us both to build and fix things. With each act, I felt myself coming back to life. This house wasn't just property, it was the physical embodiment of our family's love, history, and resilience. The night before the hearing, Susan came over with dinner. As we sat on the porch swing, she said, "You know, Emma, I haven't seen this place look so much like a home since your parents were alive." "I'm not going back to Chicago," I replied, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm staying in Boston. This is where I belong." The courthouse was packed the next morning. Rebecca sat on one side with Thomas and their attorney, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit. On our side sat Martin, myself, and, surprisingly, several neighbors from Oakwood Heights, including Susan. The judge reviewed both wills carefully, along with the evidence we'd compiled. When Rebecca took the stand, she played the grieving widow perfectly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Of course David wanted me to have the house," she said tearfully. "We had plans to renovate, to start a family. Emma abandoned him years ago. When it was my turn, I spoke from the heart. Your Honor, my brother and I shared more than DNA. We shared a deep love for our family home. Every corner holds memories of our parents, our childhood, our bond. David never would have cut me out of his will, and he certainly never would have wanted the house sold out from under our family's legacy." Then I produced the bombshell, the financial records Jenkins had uncovered and the letter David had written. The judge's expression darkened as she reviewed them. Additionally, Martin added, "We've filed a formal request with the police to investigate financial irregularities and the circumstances surrounding David Wilson's death." Rebecca gasped audibly. Thomas's face went white. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was stern. "Based on the evidence presented, I find the more recent will to be valid and enforceable. Mrs. Wilson's attempt to sell the property is hereby blocked. Furthermore, I am referring the financial evidence to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation." As we stood to leave, Rebecca charged toward me. "You've ruined everything," she hissed. "You couldn't just let me have this one thing, could you?" I looked her directly in the eyes. "This was never yours to have, Rebecca. This was David's legacy, our family's legacy. And you betrayed him in the worst possible way. Thomas tried to pull her away, but she shook him off. "You don't deserve this house. You weren't even here when he died." "No," I agreed, my voice steady. "And that will haunt me forever. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The look on her face, shock mixed with defeat, was indeed priceless. 3 months later, Rebecca and Thomas were facing charges for financial fraud. The investigation into David's death remained ongoing, with new evidence emerging regularly. They had both been released on bail, but Rebecca had moved out of the neighborhood entirely, her reputation in tatters. I had officially relocated to Boston, transferring my job to remote work. The spare bedroom had been converted into my art studio, where I was creating more than I had in years, inspired by the familiar surroundings and memories. One sunny Saturday, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue, something my parents had done every summer. The yard was filled with familiar faces and new friends. Susan brought her famous potato salad. Martin came with his wife and children. Even my colleagues from the Chicago Gallery flew in for the weekend. As twilight fell and string lights twinkled in the trees, I raised a glass to the gathering. "Thank you all for being here." A year ago, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered: my brother, my connection to this place, my sense of belonging. But standing here now, I realize that some bonds can't be broken, not by distance or death or deception. Family isn't just about blood or legal documents. It's about love, memory, and the stories these walls could tell if they could speak. I paused, looking around at the house that had witnessed my entire life's journey. David loved this place because it wasn't just a house, it was a home. A beacon calling us back when we strayed too far. I didn't realize until recently that I'd been lost for years, thinking I needed to forge a separate path. But sometimes, the bravest thing isn't leaving, it's coming home. Later, as the last guest departed, I sat alone on the porch swing, listening to the familiar creaking of the chains, the distant sound of crickets, the occasional car passing on the street. A sense of peace washed over me. David was gone, but in fighting for this house, for our legacy, I had found a way to honor him and heal myself. The journey had been painful, but necessary. The house that Rebecca had tried to sell out from under me had become my salvation. And her reaction when she realized who would be living there now that I had reclaimed my rightful place and would ensure David's memory lived on within these walls had indeed been priceless. Sometimes the inheritance worth fighting for isn't measured in square footage or market value. The true legacy we leave behind is the love we share, the memories we create, and the strength we find in standing up for what matters most. In reclaiming my brother's house, I discovered I'd also reclaimed myself, and that was the most valuable inheritance of all.